Me and one of my good friends, I'll call him Jesse, would go on camping trips once or twice a year. We used to more when we were roommates in college, but we both work full-time now. Jesse was the one who actually got me into camping, having done it his whole life. I hadn't even been camping once before I met him. This happened 2 years ago, on one of our yearly camping trips that we went on in the summer. To specify, we didn't go far out or anything. We basically went down a trail, maybe 2 hours out, then set up our tents and everything. The whole point of it was to camp, not to hike, and usually for around 4 to 5 days. When we got to a good spot, Jesse and I put everything together and relaxed. The next 3 days were just as you'd expect. We sat at the campfire and had some drinks, and just talked. We went for some walks and played some board games as well, but to sum it all up, we really just relaxed. I mean, that was the whole point of it anyway. On the 4th day, we agreed to wrap it up and head back the next morning. As the sun was starting to set, we prepared to get the campfire going again. Jesse said he'd go for a short walk and collect some dry sticks, and he asked me to get the food out and prep it for cooking. I did as he said, but as the sun faded out, Jesse still wasn't back. It had been maybe 30 minutes, which wasn't a long time for a walk, but it was a long time to be collecting sticks. I figured he must have meant he was going for a walk just to walk, and not necessarily for the sticks. I waited another 30 minutes. The sun was now fully set, and it was getting really dark. I had turned on our heavy lamp for a light source, but I knew it would run out of batteries if I left it on too long. I was getting really worried about Jesse. He was the one who was experienced in everything, so it just didn't make sense for him to get lost like this. I figured it best to at least start the fire so that if he was lost, maybe he'd see the flame and find his way back. I took the lamp and collected a bundle of sticks and started the fire with some matches. By the 2-hour mark, I was really losing it. I didn't know what to do. I was trying to decide between looking for him or going back and calling for help, or just staying put. Every scenario was running through my head. What if he'd gotten hurt and wasn't far away? Then looking for him would make sense. But if he was far away, then me getting lost would only burden everything more. 2 hours and 30 minutes after I'd last seen Jesse, and 2 hours after nightfall, I heard a gunshot. It was far off, somewhat in the direction Jesse went in, but what really scared me about it was that neither of us had brought a gun. I stood up and paced around the campsite for a minute before grabbing the lamp and going out to try and find him. It didn't take long before I heard steady footsteps running toward me. My hand was trembling, holding up the lamp, but the light only reached a few feet ahead. I saw a figure getting closer, and I barely recognized them to be Jesse. His eyes were wide open, and he looked horrified. I'd never seen anyone's expression be that visibly scared before. He told me in a sharp, hushed voice that we needed to leave right now. We ran back to the camp and got our backpacks, but left the rest behind. I questioned him, but he refused to answer until we made it out of the woods. He said someone else was there and approached him on his walk. They held him at gunpoint, making him be quiet and follow them somewhere. Before they reached wherever it was they were taking him, Jesse tried for his escape, and that's when I found him running. That's all he told me, and ever has told me every time I ask. I can tell he's purposefully leaving out some important details, but he still refuses to share them. One he specifically leaves out is the gunshot. He never mentioned it. Personally, I know Jesse is a capable guy, and it wouldn't be far off to assume he tried to overpower the man holding him up. Maybe he got the gun away from him and did what he had to do to escape. It would explain Jesse's traumatized state and why the man didn't chase him. I don't know what happened back there, but ever since, Jesse hasn't wanted to go camping again. Honestly, neither do I, but I just wish I could know the truth about what went down that night. I do a lot of small camping adventures throughout the year. I try to keep these adventures under 3 days long so that I could do them on the weekend and only have to take a day or two off from work. This was just another camping trip of mine that I'd set to go on one weekend in the middle of April. My plan, so to speak, was to hike an estimated 5 hours up to a small lake and set my camp right next to it, then stay a few nights before going back. On the morning of, I drove out there and started the hike at 8 a.m. This lake didn't have any trails leading to it, which was part of the reason I chose to hike there. It was only a 5-hour walk, so getting lost wasn't too concerning, and I wouldn't have to share my experience alongside a bunch of random people who also wanted to go camping at the same spot. 4 hours into walking though, I thought I saw someone. I was just spacing out when I saw something far ahead rush past my view. I froze in place, trying to see what or who it was and where they had gone, but there was no more movement. I wasn't looking directly at it when it happened, so I didn't have a clear enough view to know for sure that it was a person, but I paid more attention for the final hour of the hike. When I reached the lake, I was taken back by its beauty. It was the perfect place to catch a break. I didn't spend long finding a spot to set up camp, being in the trees just off to the side of the lake. Almost as soon as I did though, I saw someone. This time for sure. They were on the other side of the lake, walking around by the trees. They had no backpack or anything. They were just walking. I looked around for their campsite, but didn't see anything at all. After a minute, they walked into the forest and didn't come back. This definitely put me in a slightly nervous mood, knowing someone else was out here at a remote lake, and making me wonder if I really did see a person before while I was walking. I chose to spend the rest of the evening at my campsite, and come nightfall, I started up a fire. I kept it small to not draw too much attention. It had been almost 4 hours since I seen the person, but I was still nervous. I heated up some food and ate, then took a book out to pass the time. I got through a few pages, but I couldn't ignore this feeling like I was being watched. I knew it had to be my brain being paranoid because of earlier, but after a few minutes, I couldn't even get myself to read anymore. I put the book down and packed my stuff in the tent, preparing to go to bed. Right before I put out the fire, I did one last look around. About 15 yards away, there was someone standing. Although it was really dark, I knew they were watching me. They stood still, not moving or anything, and we both just stared at each other through the dark forest. We must have been like that for a whole minute when the person started backing up. They still faced me, but walked back into the trees until they were submerged in the darkness. I was physically shaking. What were they doing, and were they going to come back? I built the campfire larger and stayed up through the entire night. At the break of dawn, I packed everything up and moved quickly, making my way back. There wasn't a bone in my body that wanted to stay there a second longer. During my hike back, I swear I heard footsteps far behind me on multiple occasions. Even now, thinking back on it, I can feel my body tense from the fear I experienced on that trip. I don't know what that person wanted, who they were, or what they were doing out there, but based on how they were stalking me, it couldn't have been good. If I had stayed there another night, or had gone to bed in the tent, I'm almost positive I wouldn't be here today. I was on a camping trail in the northern Appalachians, I believe 5 years ago now. It wasn't anything special, just some new trail I was going along. I'd done many trails on this mountain range before, and was confident in camping and hiking them. Based on my research beforehand, I planned to be on trail for 3 days, camping the 2 nights. The first portion was a decently beaten path, but the further out I got, the less apparent the path became. I continued still, until a few things caught my attention, and I started to wonder if I was even on the right path anymore. I checked my map and compass, as well as some directional notes I made on my phone when I was researching. After looking into it, I was 90% sure I was on a different path. However, the map showed no alternative paths on the route, so I was really unsure where I was. I turned around and followed the path back to try and get on the right trail again, but it was starting to get dark and I was worried that I'd venture off and get further lost. So, I set up camp where I was. I didn't go through the effort of doing a full setup. I just put down my tent and that was about it. I bundled up in my sleeping bag and fell fast asleep. A few hours into the night, I woke up. To the best of my knowledge, it was for no other reason than having to use the bathroom. But when I unzipped the tent and went out to the trees, I noticed a glow in the distance. An unmistakable flickering glow of a campfire. My first thought was maybe someone had coincidentally followed the wrong path as well, but as I thought it over, I realized the chances of that were extremely low. It was also around 2 a.m., so having a fire going in the middle of the night like this was very unusual. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep knowing someone was nearby, and I wouldn't feel safe unless I knew they were just fellow campers. My big idea was to start a fire of my own, hopefully showing them that I was nearby if they didn't already know, and if they were planning something, then it would show them that I was awake and aware. I burned up a flame big enough for them to see, but only a minute or 2 later, they put their fire out. My face went numb. There was no way this was a coincidence too. I waited the night out, checking frequently for any sign of whoever was out there, but there was nothing else. In the morning, I rolled up my tent and got my gear ready, but my curiosity got the best of me. If they were just campers, maybe they'd know the way back too. I had my handgun holstered to my chest just in case, and I approached the site. It was empty, but there were clear signs of a fire. There were also multiple shoe prints all around, and not far off, a small hut, or maybe a cabin, not something temporary. I approached with caution and looked inside the open door. The place was old and musty smelling, but inside, there was tons of camping gear. Tents, hiking sticks, bags, everything a camper or hiker would need. Expensive gear too, not just some cheap junk. The way it was piled up though, it didn't seem like it was from one person, or even from one time frame. Some of this stuff was new, and some of it was older. I turned away and started quickly going back. By some miracle, I happened to stumble by a boulder that I remembered passing on my way up, and from there, I found my way to the right path. I took it back to the way I came and got out ASAP. I notified the police just in case, but nothing came of it. I don't think they ever searched the area, but I think whoever was out there was stealing people's camping equipment by getting them to go off the main path. I don't know how they did it, or if anyone who fell victim was able to make it out, but I think I was extremely close to finding out firsthand.
Alone deep in the woods. I needed some peace, far from the noise and rush of the city. I wanted to feel the calm of nature and find some quiet time for myself. I packed my backpack with all the essentials and drove until I found the perfect spot. The trees were tall and thick, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. It was exactly what I had been looking for. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by trees. The ground was soft, covered with fallen leaves, and the air smelled fresh and clean. I felt a sense of peace wash over me as I prepared my campsite. I built a small fire, cooked some dinner, and sat down to enjoy the calm evening. As the sun began to set, the sky turned a beautiful shade of orange and pink. The forest seemed to glow in the soft light, and I felt completely at ease. Night fell, and I settled into my tent. I was looking forward to a good night's sleep in the quiet woods. As I lay there, I started to hear a faint whistling sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing through the trees. It was a gentle, almost musical sound, and I didn't pay much attention to it. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the whistling grew louder. It was no longer a soft, distant sound. It seemed to be coming closer, getting stronger with each passing hour. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding. I listened carefully, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be moving around, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. I told myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that was growing inside me. I decided to step out of my tent and take a look around. The forest was dark, with only the light of the moon filtering through the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the campsite. The whistling stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then it started again, louder and closer than before. I walked around the clearing, trying to find the source of the sound. I saw nothing unusual, just the trees and the shadows they cast. As I was about to head back to my tent, my flashlight beam caught something strange. There were carvings on the trees around my campsite, eerie symbols and strange marks that I hadn't noticed before. They seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, and a chill ran down my spine. The whistling grew louder, almost unbearable now. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. Something was wrong. I needed to leave. I quickly packed up my things, my hands shaking. The whistling was so loud it felt like it was inside my head. As I started to head back the way I had come, I saw them. Strange, shadowy figures standing between the trees, blocking my path. They didn't move, just stood there watching me. My heart raced, and I felt a surge of panic. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, hoping to find another way out. The figures seemed to follow me, always just at the edge of my vision. No matter which way I turned, they were there, blocking my escape. The whistling was deafening now, a high-pitched sound that gave me a headache. I stumbled through the dark forest, trying to find my way out. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. In a desperate bid to escape, I remembered the trail I had come in on. I turned and ran towards it, hoping it would lead me back to safety. The figures were closer now, almost within reach. I could feel their presence pressing in on me, cold and menacing. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, I saw the edge of the forest. I burst out into the open, the whistling suddenly stopping. The silence was almost as frightening as the sound had been. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. My heart was still pounding, and my hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I reached safety, but I knew I would never forget what had happened in those woods. The eerie whistling, the strange carvings, and the shadowy figures would haunt my dreams forever. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. Camping had always been something I enjoyed when I was younger, but this time was different. I was camping with my kids, Emma and Jack, for the first time. They were nervous, especially since it was their first time spending the night in the woods. We had set up our tent in a small clearing surrounded by tall, dense trees. The air was fresh, and the smell of pine needles filled the air. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over everything. We spent the evening roasting marshmallows over the campfire and telling stories. The kids laughed and seemed to relax a bit, but I could still see the nervousness in their eyes. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. As night fell, the darkness around us seemed to grow thicker, and the forest felt more mysterious. We climbed into our tent, settling into our sleeping bags. Emma and Jack snuggled close to me, seeking comfort in the unfamiliar surroundings. I read them a story to help them relax, and soon their eyes grew heavy. Just as they were drifting off to sleep, a strange noise echoed through the trees. It was a soft, almost whispering sound, like leaves rustling together. Emma stirred and looked at me with wide eyes. "Don't worry," I whispered, trying to sound calm. "It's just the wind." She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. I listened closely, straining to hear if the noise would come again. For a few moments, there was nothing but the gentle sound of the breeze. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard it again. This time it was closer. It sounded like something moving slowly through the underbrush. My heart began to race. I didn't want to scare the kids, so I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I reached for the flashlight and clicked it on, casting a beam of light around the inside of the tent. The kids huddled closer, their eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," I said softly. "Let's just see what it is." I unzipped the tent flap slowly and shone the flashlight outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the trees and bushes around our campsite. Everything seemed still. I listened again, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Suddenly, there was a soft thud, and the tent shook slightly. It felt like something had pressed against the fabric from the outside. Emma gasped, and Jack grabbed my arm tightly. I shone the flashlight around frantically, trying to see what it was. The tent shook again, more forcefully this time, and I heard a low, growling noise. Fear gripped me. I had no idea what was out there, and the kids were terrified. I had to protect them, but I felt helpless. The growling grew louder, and the tent shook violently. Emma started to cry, and Jack buried his face in my side. "Stay close," I whispered, my voice shaking. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The growling ceased, and the forest fell silent once more. I held my breath, listening for any sign of movement. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a soft, familiar sound, a meow. Relief washed over me as I realized what had happened. Our cat, Whiskers, had followed us into the woods. She must have gotten lost and found her way to our tent, seeking shelter. I couldn't believe it. The whole time, we had been scared out of our wits by our pets. I unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside, calling softly for Whiskers. She appeared from the shadows, her eyes glowing in the flashlight beam. I scooped her up and held her close, feeling her purr against my chest. Emma and Jack peeked out of the tent, their fear turning to surprise. "It's just Whiskers," I said, smiling. The kids came out and hugged the cat, relieved and happy to see her. We brought Whiskers into the tent and settled back down. The kids snuggled close to me again, but this time they were smiling. As we lay there, I couldn't help but laugh at the situation. We had been so scared, thinking there was something dangerous outside, only to find out it was our mischievous cat. It was a reminder that sometimes our fears can get the best of us, and things aren't always as they seem. The rest of the night passed peacefully. Whiskers curled up at our feet, and the kids fell asleep quickly, their earlier fear forgotten. I stayed awake a little longer, listening to the sounds of the forest, and feeling grateful for the unexpected comfort of our furry friend. In the morning, the sun rose, casting a golden light over the campsite. The forest, which had seemed so frightening in the dark, now looked beautiful and inviting. We packed up our things, and the kids chattered excitedly about their adventure, no longer afraid of the woods. As we headed back home, I realized that this camping trip had been a success after all. We had faced our fears, found comfort in each other, and discovered that even in the darkest moments, there could be a light waiting to guide us. I love camping. Being out in nature always makes me feel free and alive. This summer, I decided to camp by the lake where my family used to go when I was a kid. The lake was beautiful, surrounded by tall trees and filled with clear water. The sound of birds and the smell of pine always brought back good memories. My father used to take me here. He loved this place. We would fish, swim, and tell stories by the campfire, but my father passed away 5 years ago. It was hard for me to come back to this place without him. I missed him so much. I arrived at the lake in the afternoon. The sun was shining and the sky was clear. I set up my tent near the water and gathered some wood for a fire later. I wanted to cook dinner and enjoy the peaceful evening. As the sun started to set, I lit the fire and cooked some fish I had caught earlier. The smell of the cooking fish filled the air, and it reminded me of the times my father and I cooked together. After dinner, I sat by the fire looking at the stars. The night was calm and the lake was still. I could hear the sound of the water gently lapping against the shore. It was a perfect night, but as I stared into the fire, I felt a strange chill. It was a sudden coldness that made me shiver. I looked around, but there was nothing unusual. I decided to take a walk by the lake to clear my head. The moon was bright, casting a silver light on the water. The trees cast long shadows, and the path was lit just enough for me to see where I was going. As I walked, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was just my imagination, and I kept walking. I reached the spot where my father and I used to fish. I stood there, looking at the water, remembering the good times we had. Suddenly, I saw something on the other side of the lake. It looked like a person standing by the water. My heart skipped a beat. I squinted my eyes to see better, and my blood ran cold. It was my father. He was standing there looking at me. He wore the same clothes he always wore when we went fishing, a plaid shirt and old jeans. His face was pale and his eyes looked sad. I froze. This couldn't be real. My father was dead. I closed my eyes and shook my head, hoping he would disappear. When I opened my eyes, he was still there, staring at me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the ghostly figure of my father. He raised his hand slowly and pointed to the water. My mind was racing. What did he want? Why was he here? Gathering all my courage, I took a step forward. Then another. Slowly, I walked around the lake towards him. My heart was pounding and my breath was shallow. As I got closer, I could see him more clearly. His eyes seemed to follow my every move. When I was just a few feet away, he lowered his hand and looked at the water again. I followed his gaze and saw something floating in the water. It looked like an old wooden box. I looked back at my father, but he was gone, vanished into thin air. My legs felt weak and I almost fell. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had to get that box. I waded into the water, the coldness biting at my skin. The box was heavier than I expected, but I managed to drag it to the shore. I sat down, soaked and shivering, and opened the box. Inside, I found old photos, letters, and a fishing lure that belonged to my father. Tears filled my eyes as I looked through the items. These were memories, pieces of my past that I thought were lost forever. Among the letters, I found one addressed to me. It was in my father's handwriting. "My dear son, if you are reading this, it means you have found the box. I hid it here because I wanted you to have these memories. They are a part of who we are and a part of our time together. I love you, and I am always with you, even if you can't see me. Take care of yourself, and remember the good times we had. The lake will always be a special place for us. Love, Dad." I sat there, clutching the letter, tears streaming down my face. My father had reached out to me from beyond the grave to give me this gift. I felt a sense of peace, knowing he was watching over me. The fear and confusion melted away, replaced by a warm feeling of love and connection. I spent the rest of the night by the fire, looking through the photos and letters, remembering my father and the times we shared. The lake was still and quiet, and the stars twinkled above. I knew that my father was still with me in spirit, and that he would always be a part of my life. The next morning, as the sun rose over the lake, I packed up my things and prepared to leave. I took one last look at the water, grateful for the experience. As I walked away, I felt a gentle breeze, as if my father was saying goodbye. I knew I would come back to this place again. The lake held our memories, and now it also had part of my father's spirit.
I was out camping in a familiar forest in Colorado. I lived a couple hours away, but came out every couple months when the weather was nice. I'd already had my camp set up and was there for 2 full days. I spent those days getting the tent situated and going fishing, not really doing much else. On the 3rd day though, I set out on a hike just north of my campsite. There were no trails out there, so I was just going partially up the mountainside in a general direction. I knew all the landmarks near my camp and had all the necessary equipment to make sure I didn't get lost, so I was just enjoying the walk. It was probably a little past midday at this point, and as I walked further up, I noticed a column of smoke coming from behind me. It almost looked like it was coming from right by my campsite. I walked around to try and get a better view, and as far as I could tell, there was something burning either at my campsite or somewhere in the close area. I quickly made my way back, worrying about what it could be, but I knew that I hadn't left the fire going, so I really had no idea. Once I got about a quarter mile away from the base of the smoke, it became more apparent that it wasn't directly from my camp. I made it back to confirm, and nothing was wrong with anything. The smoke was coming from somewhere very close though, just far enough into the trees for me to not see anything. I thought about going and seeing what it was, but the only thing it could be at this point was someone else's campfire. It was strange that someone happened to be out here in the exact place I was, because again, there were no trails leading to this specific spot, but I definitely didn't want to run into some random people out here, so I stayed at my camp. I didn't really think much else on it. I just went on with my day and did some other things around the camp. Probably an hour passed before I casually looked around and felt my body stiffen when I saw a man standing in the forest. It was so unexpected, and the way he was standing seemed like he was just looking at me. Being so oblivious, I had no idea how long he'd been there. I lifted up my arm and did a nervous wave, but the man didn't wave back. He was too far to see if he was actually watching me, but he was definitely facing toward the campsite. After a minute, I went back to what I was doing, but I kept my eyes up and checked every now and then, and the man stayed in that same spot for almost 15 minutes before he was finally gone. That had really creeped me out. There just didn't seem to be any reason for someone to be acting like that. I waited a few hours, watching my surroundings the whole time, before walking over to where I'd seen the man standing. I wanted to see if there was something there that might have had his attention, but I didn't see anything. It was just another part of the forest. I went back to my camp as the sun was beginning to set. I tried to tell myself there was nothing, and I was overthinking all of it, but the more I really thought about it, the more I got creeped out. By the time the sun had fully set, I still hadn't seen anything else though. I was sitting right outside of my tent and got the fire going. I don't know how long I was out there for, at least an hour, before I noticed a flickering light to my left. It was from another campfire out in the forest close by. Oddly, it wasn't in the direction I'd seen the smoke coming from earlier in the day though. It was near where I'd seen the man. I stood up, now feeling that unnerving sense building up in me again. Looking closer, I could actually see the base of the campfire, but it didn't look like anyone was around it. I moved my eyes around the dark forest, carefully scanning the entire area, and as my eyes moved around, I saw something else. Behind a bush, only 10 or 15 feet away, I could see a face looking back at me. My heart stung from the immediate stress and fear that ran through me. For the few seconds I looked at them though, it seemed like the figure didn't think I could see him. He was definitely looking back at me, but remained completely still. I took a few steps back, standing behind my campfire and keeping my eyes locked in the direction of the man. The most terrifying 30 minutes of my life passed extremely slowly before I saw the figure begin moving back, making his way further into the forest. They stayed crouched and moved slowly all the way back, until they were fully covered by the dark and the trees. I remained with my eyes wide open and shifting around in all directions for the whole night, not seeing anything more. Once the sun was lighting up the forest enough, I packed up and headed out, walking as fast as I could until I made it back to my car. Whatever was going on out there was far too suspicious, and something told me that staying there any longer would only put me at risk of finding out the extent to their likely harmful intentions. I'm a 26-year-old male, and this happened last year. I was taking a vacation alone, and one of my friends owned a cabin near the area I was planning on visiting. It all worked out really well and saved me a ton of money, which I was super grateful for. This cabin that they owned I'd never been to, but I'd heard my friend talk about it a lot and I'd seen pictures. It sounded like the most cozy and relaxing place in the world, and that's exactly what I wanted out of this vacation. It was very isolated, I'd say about 40 minutes outside of the closest town, which felt pretty far for me, though a lot of that time was due to it being located on a dirt road that you'd have to drive really slow on. Anyway, when I arrived, I must have spent a whole hour just standing outside and looking off in the distance, enjoying the nature and quietness. Afterwards, I made an early dinner and was on my phone for a while, then decided to use up the rest of the daylight with a short walk. There were several small trails right next to the cabin that I'd noticed when I was standing out there. I texted my friend to make sure they were actually trails and wouldn't get me lost, but he assured me that I had nothing to worry about. He said the closest one to the back of the cabin was just a straight line through and out of the woods. That sounded perfect to me, so I put on some walking boots and started down the trail. It wasn't the smoothest walking trail, but it wasn't all that bad either. It definitely wasn't anything I could get lost on, and that was my only real concern. I walked for probably just under half an hour, looking at the nature around me and letting my mind wander, until I heard something that confused me enough to get me to stop. But as soon as I stopped, it went quiet. Then, just a moment later, I heard it again. A man's voice, speaking loudly with a harsh tone. It sounded somewhat far, though. I looked at the woods around me, trying to locate where the man was. I heard him speak again, somewhere far off to the right of the trail, but I still couldn't see him. It sounded like he was talking to someone, though, or yelling at them. I didn't want to leave the trail, but something about this made me think there was something wrong. I didn't know if any other cabins or houses were out here, so there was no way for me to really know if it was unusual for anyone to be by this trail, but them not being on the trail made it strange. I listened for another couple minutes, hearing the man several times speak angrily towards something. It wasn't in English, so I couldn't understand him, and strangely, nobody ever responded, at least not loud enough for me to hear. Eventually, I decided to walk a bit closer to try and see who was there. I didn't want to make myself known, I just wanted to be sure that nothing crazy was going on. I was careful to not lose sight of the trail as I walked deeper into the woods, but once I got closer, all of the talking and yelling stopped. After a moment, I started to get really uneasy and jogged back to the trail. Everything going on just gave me the sense that I was in danger, and being out in the woods was probably the last place I wanted to have that feeling. The sun was beginning to come down as well, so that was my cue to get back to the cabin. I walked quickly, and just a couple minutes down the trail, I heard leaves crunching from the woods. I jolted my head around, but shadows casting from the trees made it difficult to see clearly. It sounded like someone was running behind me from somewhere out in the woods, not too far away. I turned around and ran the rest of the way to the cabin, getting inside and locking everything up. I looked out the back window and immediately saw a man walking toward the cabin. He was wearing a thick hoodie and had something in his hand. In a quick and desperate moment, I made the decision to grab my keys and run for my car at the front of the cabin. I got in and drove off, not seeing anyone follow. After talking with my friend, he made it clear that nobody should have been out there. What that man was doing or who he was yelling at is unknown, but if I had stayed in the cabin, I probably would have never been seen again. Before I get into this next story, I want to talk about an important sponsor for today's video. Aura is an advanced online digital security service, allowing you to scan and remove your personal data from various online sources, including scam centers, the dark web, and data brokers. These entities profit from your private information, making it crucial to eliminate your data from their reach. And Aura makes it as simple as possible for us to do this. With their free trial, I was registered in minutes and had Aura scan and remove my data with just a few clicks. They notified me about dozens of places all across the internet where they found my personal data, like my full name, phone number, and address. And without Aura, I never would have known. Afterwards, Aura continuously monitors my data, instantly notifying me of any issues that arise and enabling swift resolution. They also include a feature to encrypt your home's Wi-Fi, ensuring the security of all your connected devices. In today's world, personal identity and data theft are unfortunately widespread, affecting a significant number of US citizens, with millions falling victim each year, resulting in huge financial losses. With Aura, you can have the utmost confidence in your security and prevention measures. For a completely free 14-day trial, visit aura.com/whispered or scan the provided QR code. During this trial, you can discover if your personal data has been compromised, remove your data from multiple prominent platforms, and securely monitor your personal identity. I highly recommend using this free trial to see if your data has been stolen and to keep your identity secure. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video and keeping our personal data secure. My friend and I lived in a small town outside of Seattle, and for the prior few years, we'd both gotten really into camping, hiking as well, but there was something about setting up a camp and just living out there among the wildlife that hit differently. When this happened, it was spring of 2021. We had planned out a typical camping trip not far away, but with our schedules at work being a little mismatched, it took a bit of finessing to figure out a good few days to go. In the days leading up though, my manager had to push back my requested days off by a day, which messed everything up. I told my friend, who I'll refer to as Brandon, and he said it was alright since it was just a day off, saying he'd hike out there and set up camp and just spend the first night alone. He insisted on it and said he'd enjoy it, so who was I to stop him? He let me know when he got there and set everything up, and it all seemed good. On the following morning, I drove out and started making my way to the campsite. This wasn't really a common place, mainly because there were so many other campsites around, but it still had a well-made trail and a cleared-out site that was made for campers to stay at, so it wasn't just some random spot in the forest. I texted him while I was on my way, but lost service before I was able to receive anything back. During the walk though, there were several times where my phone had gained a bit of service, and I still hadn't gotten a text back. I thought maybe he was having service issues, or possibly it was something wrong with my phone, but basically there were a million reasons why I didn't get a text back, so I wasn't too surprised. But once I got to the camp, something was missing. Brandon. I checked the tent in the nearby areas, but he wasn't anywhere. I still wasn't too worried. I knew there was a few places around that he could have gone. A nearby river for fishing, and a couple trails with nice views. He really could have been anywhere. I put my bag down and set up my tent, then got a fire going to heat up some canned food I'd brought with. It was only noon, so if he had gone to the river or down a trail, he probably wouldn't be back until 3 or 4. But once 5 rolled around, I started to get nervous. I tried to see if I could make out any shoe prints to show which way he may have went, but honestly, I had no idea. There were a ton of shoe prints all over the area that had no clear direction. My phone had no service still, so there weren't many options for me to go out and find him. My only logical choice was to stay where I was and just hope he came back. Hiking out when the sun only had another 30 minutes of light left was just asking for a disaster. I put some more wood into the fire and sat down, hoping for the best, but uncontrollably fearing the worst. I didn't know if he'd gotten hurt, lost, or was just enjoying himself on a hike. And that's when I saw a light flash by a few trees ahead of me. It moved around like someone was walking with it, and it was near one of the trails. I felt some relief, thinking it had to be Brandon. It came closer, getting brighter and even close enough for me to hear footsteps in the distance. But then all of a sudden, right before I thought I'd see who it was, it shut off, and the footsteps stopped. "Brandon?" I called out. It was silent, no movement or response. My stomach tightened, and I called out again. "Brandon? Who's out there?" It remained silent, furthering the disturbing gut feeling I had. To make it all worse, I stared into the darkness, waiting and listening for over an hour, hearing absolute silence aside from the sounds of the woods. I never heard the person leave, but I could feel that he was still out there watching me. I got up and started packing my things, going quickly while still watching my back. Something in me just told me to get out of there and find help, so that's what I did. I don't think I was followed, as I made it out without any more incidents, but police weren't able to help me until the following day. We went back out there, finding everything how I'd last seen it, but Brandon was still gone. They tracked him, going off one of the trails and deeper into the woods, showing another set of shoe prints right next to his. Unfortunately, Brandon never turned up, and the whole thing went cold after a couple days. It's believed that he was likely taken by the person that was out there with him, and that was likely the same person I'd encountered. It's just terrible thinking about whether things would have ended up differently if I had been able to go with him on the first day, or if I too would have gone missing.
I used to love taking my family on camping trips. There was this specific set of campgrounds up in the Catskill Mountains that we used to visit as often as we could during the spring, summer, and fall. But that was ruined for us the last time we were there. At that time in our life, it was just me, my wife Kim, and our daughter Millie, and we couldn't have been more excited to get to our campsite. My plans were simple: set up tents, go on a hike, and then catch some fish for dinner. Sadly, there was a wrench thrown into the mix when I noticed that we weren't alone on the trail that led to the campgrounds that I used. This didn't happen often, but every now and then we would run into fellow hikers or campers, but there was something different about this guy. I don't know what it was, but as soon as I noticed him walking behind us on the trail, I decided to keep Millie and my wife very close to me, and I put myself between them and the man as we walked. After about an hour of hiking, we made it to the place where we were going to set up our tents, and I was happy to see that the man who was following us just kept on walking. As I set up our tents, I tried my best to convince myself that this guy was just a hiker and there was nothing to worry about. And honestly, by about halfway through the day, I had forgotten all about him. The sun started to go down and I began setting up s'mores for Kim and Millie when I could have sworn that I heard something walking around in the distance. I stopped what I was doing and looked around our campsite for a moment to make sure it was clear, and I didn't see anything, so I decided not to worry Kim about it. I finished making us our snacks and then we all continued having fun before bed. I stayed awake for about an hour past everyone just to make sure the fire was actually out and that all of our stuff was put away. But when it was time for me to go to sleep, boy did I pass out. I slept really well for about 20 minutes before I woke up to my wife poking me and whispering for me to wake up. I looked over at her and saw that she looked horrified. and then I looked past her to see that Millie was also awake. My wife caught my attention again and whispered that someone was in our camp. So I listened closely, and sure enough, I could hear someone moving around right outside of our tent. I told Kim to stay in the tent with Millie as I made my way out to see who or what was in our camp, and as soon as I popped my head through the entrance of the tent, I saw who it was. I recognized the man who was following us up the hiking trail earlier that day, and it looked like he was going through our cooler and all of the food that we had left out. Before I could say anything, he noticed me getting out of the tent and immediately dropped the food that he was holding. I tried to calmly ask him what he was doing, but before I could get a sentence out, he charged me and tackled me back toward the tent. We both fell onto the tent, causing my wife and daughter to both scream from inside of it, and I don't know if it was the sound of them screaming or the fact that he didn't mean to fall over with me, but the man was clearly startled after that and simply took off running in the opposite direction. I checked to make sure that Millie and Kim were all right before taking a flashlight and looking around for that guy. I couldn't find him, which means he must have run pretty far away from the camp, but we still didn't feel safe sleeping there. After I got back to our tent, we all decided to pack up, and in the middle of the night started walking back to our car. It was an hour-long hike through the dark woods to our vehicle, and every now and then I swear I heard someone walking behind us. Thankfully, the man never showed his face again, and we managed to make it back to the car without any incident. We made it home early the next morning, and I made sure to report the incident to the owner of the property that the hiking trail and campsite were located on. Sadly, that was our last trip to that campsite. None of us felt it was safe there anymore. Camping alone can be one of the most peaceful experiences of your life, but if you aren't prepared for anything and everything, it can be equally terrifying. I learned that when I was camping by myself in the Rocky Mountains. I had been out there for 2 days, but this time I brought enough provisions to last me the entire week, if not more. It's too bad I didn't even get the chance to use half of them before learning how truly treacherous the wilderness can be. It was the middle of the night on my second day there, and I was sleeping pretty well until I was woken up by the sudden sound of running water. As soon as I opened my eyes and became conscious, I could feel that I was laying in water that was about an inch deep and quickly rising. Even in my tired state, I could tell what was happening. I was caught in the middle of a flash flood, and it was coming in quickly. I knew my best chance of making it out of the situation would be to get out of my tent and then move to the side of the flowing water to hopefully get out of it without being swept away. Sadly, it was too late. As soon as I started to get up, I felt the bottom of the tent being lifted and swayed by the water that was rushing by. And by the time I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, it started to be pulled along with the rushing water. I tried to get my body out of the tent as it started to flip from the force of the water that was quickly rising, and I managed to step out and stand upright. By that point, the water level had risen to where it was just above my knee, and it seemed to be moving even faster now. I tried to make my way over to the edge of the rushing water, but the second I lifted 1 foot, the pull of the water forced me to topple over. I fell face first into the water and tried to get my footing again, but it was like fighting against rapids at that point. That's how fast flash flooding can happen. I guess that's why they call it flash flooding. Before I knew it, I was being swept away just like my tent was. I tried to relax my body and brace for any rocks that I might be smacked into as I followed the flow of the flood, and it helped for the most part. Anytime I came across a small rock, I just sort of rolled off the side of it with the water. That is until I thought the water was calming down. I thought I noticed myself slowing down and decided to try to swim to the side of the flood, but as soon as I did, my leg smacked into a branch or a rock underneath the water, which sent a shooting pain up my entire leg. I cried out in pain before I started trying to swim against the current again. Thankfully, I was right and the flood had been slowing down. I was able to make my way over to the side of the flood bank to land that was only soaked by the rain. I pulled myself out of the water and then tried to get myself far away from the flood in case it spread out further. As soon as I thought it was safe enough to lie down, I did. I needed to take a break and breathe as I figured out what had just happened to me. I was pretty upset with myself for not checking the weather for that week, but ultimately figured that all I could do was make it out of that forest alive. I tried to get up and walk, but my ankle was clearly busted from whatever I had hit under the water, so I couldn't really put much weight on it. I managed to hobble very slowly through the woods until daylight. When I could finally see my surroundings, I could tell that I was heading in the right direction and continued to slowly make my way back to my car. I had to take frequent breaks because of my ankle, but I knew that if I didn't make it out of the woods that night, I might not have made it out at all. It wasn't until almost sundown on the day after the flash flood that I finally found the trail that I had used to get to my campsite. It took me another half hour to get back to my car, and when I did, the first place I went to was the hospital. From there, I was able to call my family and let them know what happened to me and that I was fine. But that was the last time I went camping on my own. I never really was a camping type of person, but my cousins wanted me to go camping for their 19th birthday and I couldn't turn it down. They decided to bring me to a campsite that they had apparently been going to for years. But there were a few red flags for me on the trail. The main fact being that the trail passed through an old campsite that was all torn apart. It looked like a crazy animal had gotten a hold of the tent and everything or everyone inside. But according to my cousins, the tent had been there for years. They said that no one cleaned it up in honor of a camper who had died there, but I thought there was something strange about that. It sort of felt like they were just making that up to keep my nerves from going insane. We continued walking through the woods until we eventually hit a point where I could see a fire pit that had been set up. My cousin said that this was their campsite, and we began setting up for the night. I was the last one to get his tent finished, but by that point, my cousin Marcus had already started the fire, so I was able to just chill. The sun quickly set, and before we knew it, we couldn't see anything around us. All that was visible were the three of us and the fire that sat between us as we talked about old family reunions and parties. It started to get pretty fun, if I'm being honest, but that all went away the moment we heard that scream. We all fell silent as the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs began coming from the woods. I looked at Marcus and asked him what was going on. He said he wasn't sure, and we all continued to listen. My eyes grew wide as I heard the scream again. There were no words, just a loud, blood-curdling scream. We all looked at each other as if none of us knew what we should do. I grabbed my flashlight and started shining it around us as the screaming continued. I began to panic as it started to get louder and louder, as if it was heading right toward us. Then out of nowhere, the screaming faded, but it wasn't followed by silence. I'll never forget the feeling in my bones when I heard the unmistakable sound of an animal growling in the distance. I continued to frantically shine my light around, and my cousins joined in, but no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't find anything despite it sounding as if it was right on top of us. After about 20 minutes, all of the noises started to fade away, but still no sign of the animal that was the cause of it. My cousins and I sat around the fire for the rest of the night in a panicked state, looking around as if something was going to jump out of the woods and grab us. Hours passed, but they seemed like days, and when the sun finally started to shine in the sky, we all couldn't wait to get out of there. We quickly packed our things and started walking back down that trail. Each of us moved slowly as we were all looking around, expecting to see signs of whatever we had heard that night, but there was nothing at all. We made it back to the car and then drove back into town to grab something to eat at the diner. And while we were making small talk with our waitress, we explained to her what had just happened to us, and she told us that her son used to go camping up there and once told her the same exact story. We never did figure out what we were hearing that night, but that was the last time I ever went camping. No one would ever convince me to go again.